Welcome to this episode of Themes and Variations. I'm here with Kari Turunen, who is an incredible choral conductor and an amazing music educator. Kari is also the present artistic director of the Vancouver Chamber Choir, an organization that has contributed to the Canadian choral music scene greatly since 1971, I believe. So thank you for being here, Kari. How was life like growing up in Finland, especially with regards to music education and things like that?
I'm sort of the pretty much the first generation that benefited from the national music education system. It sort of stands on two pillars, or stood maybe a bit better. One of them was the specialized music classes in ordinary schools. So in every city would have at least one school with a set of classes that had music as a sort of specialty.
Right.
And that meant that they could sort of, go a bit lighter on the academic subjects and had, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours at least of music together, which pretty much meant, music theory, singing in a choir. The classroom formed a choir and so on. Very much, this was sort of very much the Hungarian model.
Right.
And a lot of these people also even used the Kodai system early
Right.
on. And then the other pillar of it is an after school music college or music school system that is spread around the country and is actually legislated.
Right.
So the money comes mainly from the government,
Right.
which means any politician can only affect the funding that comes locally, but still the bulk of the funding will still be there because
Right.
it's legislated. And this was sort of put in place, I guess, the 60s and 70s. So I was growing up at just that time. So I'm definitely I have to say that I'm a product of that school,
Right.
albeit it was interrupted for almost 5 years because my family lived in Australia. And so I missed a lot of the very formative years and like my theoretical skills when we came back when I was age 13, 14, were pretty hopeless. So there was an ingenious headmaster at the music school who said, well, you're not much of a cellist, but would you like to try the double bass? And I did. And I don't know if I was that great at it, but it did give me a chance to sort of become a musician,
Right.
partially through that.
So you'd say like around your early teenage years, that's when your formal music education kind of started?
Well, it started already before that. Sort of, I was taken to cello lessons as a, I think, 6, 7 year old.
Right.
But that really didn't ever take off. Just I don't think I ever liked the instrument. I love the sound of a cello,
Right.
and but it never sort of spoke to me. And it took me a while with the double bass, sort of
Right.
getting through the difficult teenage years before I sort of saw the light
Right.
and I started practicing. And we lived in an apartment building, and some of the neighbors would comment, "Oh, you've started practicing the bass." And yeah. And then when I heard everyone whistling the pieces that I was playing outdoors, and I thought, okay, I'm playing enough, I think.
That's good. That's good. So the way you're taught bass, I believe that in America, bass also has a very much of a jazz kind of background, and I don't think
Mm.
that probably is the same thing in Finland at that time. Is that
No, mine was a very classical upbringing. I mean, there were no sort of boundaries in that you can't. And I do have some friends who, one of them played in a heavy rock band,
right?
one of them played folk music. So it was sort of, use it for whatever, but the technique was pretty much the sort of the classical
Right.
double bass technique that made it possible to play in orchestras and so on.
The traditional music of Finland, or music from that part of the world, like how did that integrate into the Western system as we kind of speak of it right now?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's always been the Western system. I mean, since as far back as it's sensible to look as far as music education goes.
Right.
So and I think there was a strong influence from the Eastern side, so it's sort of very strict Russian school of, especially in some instruments, that you had to play at a certain, like the violin, there were
Right.
Russians, the Russian school and some other
Right.
school, really, really, really strict. Um, so they're definitely sort of the music education system was centered on Western, especially instrumental training was centered on the Western tradition. But there was and is a very vibrant folk music tradition and scene. I'll sort of start the wrong way around. Last summer when we were there, I drove through the night after a concert through beautiful landscapes and sort of it was getting to 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, it was still light. And there was a program on which featured new Finnish folk music bands. And the variety and the energy and the expression, which is amazing. There really is a vibrant tradition, a living tradition. So it's not sort of a, we upkeep the traditional kind of music making. It's very much different. But sort of when I was growing up, it was either a very conservative, and I mean that in a literal sense, to conserve conservative tradition that tried to upkeep the way it has been played
Mm-hmm.
in these parts, say the
Mm-hmm.
violin or the songs or whatever. And then there were the romanticized folk songs, which I think
Right.
people know almost best from that part of the world, which in a way are wonderful, but they're not really very original folk music in any sense.
Right.
But in the, I think it was the early 80s, this was still a time when people put money into education and arts. Um, Two departments were founded at the Sibelius Academy, the music university in Finland. One of them was the so-called jazz
Mm-hmm.
department, which
Mm-hmm.
meant all sorts of sort of rhythmic music
Mm-hmm.
types. It just played a great role in sort of the development of all sorts of music in Finland, because now a lot of the people are really well trained,
Right.
even, say, rock musicians. Um, that sounded a bit belittling. I don't mean that. Rock music is fantastic and it needs a lot of skill. But and then the other one was folk music.
Right.
And when they founded this department, they sort of stood at a crossroad. What do we do? Sort of, what does it mean to have an academic folk music department?
Right.
And they could have chosen the conservation
Right.
model,
Right.
where then they would, dig into archives and old recordings and try to play exactly like that was played. But what they chose was that it's a living tradition, it's a text. So you go into the archives and you look for these folk poems, which are very often quite sort of raunchy,
Right.
sort of not very proper. And they took those poems and then the styles of folk music from both Finland, but also, the fiddle playing of Norway,
Right.
the Bulgarian type singing of Eastern Europe,
Right.
and they said it's all fair game.
Right.
Mix it up,
Right.
use the folk stuff as text, and create from that. So it's very different if you can compare to say like Indian classical music. I think they'd probably not be very happy if you said, "Well, I'm going to add a didgeridoo to this and some Bulgarian singing." So they chose a very different path, which I think has proven to be incredibly enriching to say even choral music. There's a whole body of works now which are based on folk music but are not folk music. They're sort of new creations by folk musicians.
Right. Right.
And I think that's something that sort of happened during my becoming a musician, that when I was young, folk music was this sort of conservative, traditionalistic thing.
Right. Right.
And then as I sort of grew, this movement from the 80s on just has exploded, and it's incredibly interesting. And I would sort of argue that it's one of the few truly living folk music traditions, which means that they're always changing, right?
Right,
That
right. Yeah.
we only conserve when we sort of go back and try to conserve,
Right,
but if you leave it alone, it
right,
will develop.
right, right. Just like the
And
languages
there's a
that we
great
speak evolve.
exactly, and there's a great example of this that I knew some musicologists who went to the US to study how folk music was in Finland in the 1930s, because the people who moved to the US in the early 20th century, they preserved it because it was part of their, their heritage and
Right,
their
right,
identity.
right,
They kept it pure.
right,
So
right,
they could go and research
right,
what Finnish folk music was like 60 years ago.
right.
And I thought that was so interesting. So that's sort of the two approaches. And I think, very often you can sort of think that these approaches are almost true for anything, that you either conserve or you let it develop.
Right. And are they mostly based on song traditions or
Both, definitely. The eldest layers of tradition are song, and they're very often sort of what they call runic songs, so that you recite epic poems that
right,
tell
right,
of the creation of the world,
right,
and these are sort of pre-Christian, but they
right,
also Christian elements at some point
right,
sort of slip in.
right,
So that they're sort of hundreds and hundreds of years old,
right,
but then and people always wanted to dance. You didn't have records and to create dance music. So either it was sung sort of round songs, sort of repetitive songs, or then instrumental stuff. So the instrumental stuff developed. I don't know. I wouldn't dare to say exactly when, but I would assume from maybe the sort of 17th, 18th centuries on, as
mhm,
as instruments became more common. Um, so the violin is pretty important in Finnish folk music and Swedish and Norwegian folk music. But I think these just come at different times, and they're also sort of different styles a little bit. And if you listen to the instrumental stuff that is played, sort of the new creative instrumental stuff, it's often reminds a little bit one of Irish folk
mhm,
music,
mhm,
sort of those kind of rhythm dances and
mhm,
cross rhythms and so
mhm.
on. So they're sort of, yes, sort of as an answer to your question, yeah, the song stuff was first, definitely. Um, but then on the side of it, there's always been, or for a long time, there's also been the instrumental
I guess
music.
that's a nice place to segue into choral music because in
Mm.
the history of Western music as well, it is coming out of a sung tradition. I can argue that point, even though we had mentions of instruments from Greek period onwards, but still, when we look at the development of harmony, the choral music has played an incredible role in that category. So, what was your first exposure to choral music, like studying an instrument in university versus kind of taking choral music seriously?
No, school again. Um, but because I'd been away for 5 years, and my peers at school had kept singing, we came back to the same city. So in a way, it was weird that I went back to the same class that I would
Right,
have been in, but I was just away for 5 years.
right,
So I was sort of, they were sight reading stuff, and I was sort of, what are they doing? So I had no idea. But then fortunately, and I'd always sung. Sort of, our family always sang quite a bit. Um, so it wasn't that far off. But then I had a girlfriend who sang in a choir, youth choir, and she just said, "Come on." And then I was probably 17 at the time,
right,
and that was the formative experience as far as choral music goes.
right,
We began. It was the youth choir of a congregation, Lutheran congregation, and the first songs we sang were actually quite interestingly these African songs. Very simple in many ways, but sort of I still remember some of them, sort of the lines and everything. So they were pretty cool. And then the conductor sort of, as we developed, started introducing things. And I just remember one time that there were a couple of pieces. One was a motet by Johann Bachelbel,
I don't know that.
and yeah, he's sort of a not that well-known Germanic composer, but completely solid, early 18th century, I think. And then a Bach motet, and especially the Bach motet was sort of, what is this? Because I'd always been more into sports than music. And that was the moment when I thought, oh, this is the same thing. This is sport. The jungle of notes,
Right.
that you have to have stamina, you have to be able to intuitively sort of guess what's coming. And oh, this is it. And in some, I mean, it's, we all come up with stories about our lives that are probably not very true. But that's one story that I tell myself, is that that's probably the moments that made me think that, that this is a possibility of choral music as a life, and if not a profession, at least something that will sort of follow me through my life.
Right. How much impact do you think choral music has in our society these days?
Depends on where you are.
Right.
I think that the strongest role it would play would probably be the Baltic countries, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, where it has an amazing political importance,
Right.
sort of national identity importance. And of course, that's partially based on the fact that they are very unified as nations,
Right.
very very non-diverse in some ways,
Right.
but that makes it possible that it is such a key um, element of the coherence
Right.
of the national identity. Like if I was on a jury of choral competition in Riga, Latvia, and the cultural minister sat through it,
Right.
the whole
That,
competition, not just the final, just the whole thing.
right.
The president was there
Right.
for the award winning
Right.
sort of ceremony. What's going on? And at the end of it, one of the conductors stood up in front of the audience and the choirs and conducted something, and everyone sang in parts,
Wow.
which is sort of try that anywhere else.
Right.
And, so that you have these cultures where it really has it's such a thread
Right.
through the culture, the musical life, even sort of political identity. And then sort of varying from there to pretty much nothing.
There are also a lot of
um,
great choral composers from those parts of the world, right? Like Waltz is a Latvian composer,
yeah,
right? Yeah.
yeah.
And
There are, and that's just because it's so popular, it's so important that it just it begets music for itself. It's just that's how it goes. But yeah, sort of those are the exceptions in the world, and I mean that's also true for all sort of classical music
right.
genres, that their importance varies quite a lot
Right.
from one place to another.
Right.
Um, and I'm struck every time I'm in Finland by the ever presence of classical culture and classical music culture, um, without it being sort of the great exception. But there are these places in the world where it just is seen by a good chunk of the population as something really important and
Right.
interesting. And then it varies, but I don't think there's very many places where it has no role at all.
Right. So, going back to you getting inspired by hearing Bach for the first time or being able to sing Bach motets for the first time, where did it take you next?
Yeah, I'm going to say enough that sort of I come from a weird family in the sense that my parents were choral singers as well. And Bach was not a novelty, but just the physical sensation of singing was so different.
Right.
It was so different to what you heard. So that would made a big impact on me. My identity was a double bass player,
Right.
and I thought there's not much in the world that would be as boring as being a double bass player in an orchestra for your whole life. That was, and there was a certain arrogance in me speaking, because I'm sure I would have been completely happy with that kind of life, but it just didn't appeal to me. I just thought there's so much in this world. I was sort of academically pretty good, and I had a lot of choices. A lot of my colleagues always say I had no other choice than music. It just, I could not even think of anything else. I could think of tens of things. So I started off actually by doing an undergrad in theology, um, which was sort of a family background thing, and but also so just I thought it was the broadest education I could think of. You know, you had these ancient languages, you had
Right.
sociology, philosophy,
Right.
um, so everything was incorporated in it. And so and it wasn't, I actually quite enjoyed it, but then I'd also we founded a choir ourselves when we were about 19, 20. That was really important because it sort of, we did have sort of ask a conductor to do it, but the conductor wasn't that committed. So we actually did a lot of the programming.
Right.
So it sort of gave me a possibility to sort of really go deeper into it. And then I joined some very good choirs, student choirs, and somehow it just ended up that people started saying, well, you could be the sort of assistant conductor. I sort of, looking back, I do not understand how they could think that, but I ended up in these positions, and then it started sort of tickling more and more.
Right.
So that's it's sort of one thing led to another, and then it led to a master's in conducting
That is
a little
amazing.
later.
Do you have you conducted orchestras as well, or was your focus primarily on choir?
Yeah, I did. I had a chamber orchestra at one point, sort of regularly, and I did quite a few operettas and musicals. So I have done it quite a bit, but at some point I just realized that very few people are good at both. Very,
Hmm.
very, very few people are really good at both,
Hmm.
because they just seem to require, the podium time with each
Right.
instrument, and that very few people get that.
Right.
So I just thought, well, I seem to be okay at this choral stuff, so I
Right.
think it's better that I concentrate on this. But I still do now and then. So that I don't feel sort of that it would be in any way sort of difficult for me, but just I do acknowledge that
Right.
the bulk of my skills is with singers.
Right. There's also, I would imagine, a difference in the way you would conduct a rehearsal session. Conduct not as in like the activity of conducting, but in general, how you run a
Yeah,
rehearsal.
yeah, and there's one really interesting difference, which is time. That even though I conduct a professional choir and time is money, so we try to minimize rehearsals, but it's still a whole lot more than a
Hmm.
professional orchestra ever gets.
Right.
So they're just that, it's natural because singers don't have any absolute system. Like the
Right.
violinist
Right.
knows that the G is when I press the
Right.
third finger of this, and blah blah.
Right.
Um, Singers don't have that, so you really have to have an inner hearing
Right.
of anything you're going to perform. So that
Right.
takes a little bit more time, even with people who sight read
Right.
extremely well.
Right.
So time changes the dynamic, which means that you can maybe talk a little bit more. And I think choral music, because there's always the text.
Right.
There's always both the text as a physical being.
Hmm. Hmm.
How do we pronounce this? How
Hmm.
do we sort of shape it? But also what it means.
Right.
And then there's even one level more, which is sort of the metaphorical. What are we saying?
Right.
What is the poem saying? And that's something that is very hard to say with your hands.
Right.
So there is this element of that more words are definitely used. But I do try to minimize them as much as I can. But I just that, as you say, that the beings, the beasts, are a little bit different, and they need to be sort of
Treated as such.
handled a little
Right.
bit differently. Yeah.
Right. And also, there's this added difficulty of singing in foreign languages that are not native to the singers, and
Yeah, definitely.
all the linguistic challenges that comes with that, how pronouncing works and how do you align everybody's pronunciation and things like that. So when you went to the master's program, were you exposed to a different array of choral music, so to speak, or was it just strictly from a Finnish or Scandinavian background, or was it more global in that aspect?
Mm, yeah, I think somewhere in between. Definitely not just Finnish and Nordic, although that did play a big role. But I'd say sort of if there is a canon or a corpus of sort of central choral works, that's what you try to go through. Actually, the degree that we did meant that you had to do both at that point, both a bachelor's and a master's. So it was 5.5 years. This
Right.
was the sort of estimated length of it. Um, so it was a lot of time to go through music. And most of it, I mean, I think we got through the sort of the bulk of what you would sort of think of as a central repertoire for choir. And that's, of course, mainly, I'd say, European. So anything from outside of the European canon, as it were, was an exception.
Hmm.
It wasn't sort of unheard of in any way.
Hmm.
But even, music from US, let alone Canada,
Hmm.
didn't come up that much.
Right.
And that was partially, of course, sort of the system, but it was also our own doing because we were very free to choose what we wanted to say.
Right.
What am I going to do next week? I
Right.
could suggest, I
Right.
like to do this.
Right.
So if I'd been more enlightened,
Right.
I could just as well, say I'd like to try a Murray Schafer piece or a
Right.
Stephen Chapman piece, but
Right.
I wasn't enlightened.
Right.
um, but yeah, I said definitely, and looking back, even like 30 years, the choral world was really different. So if you look at it now, um, the the layers that are quite natural for choirs to assume are much there's just so much more of them. Um, I think it's a little bit different in Northern America. The situation is different to Europe, but I see it in my younger Finnish colleagues that they're much more interested in music from around the world.
Right.
Um, I,
Probably social media and everything played a big role
yes,
in.
yeah. I mean, the internet changed so much in the
Right.
sense that you could actually hear stuff and
Right.
find the scores.
Right.
Before you had to somehow miraculously hear a piece, then you
Right.
had to order it from somewhere, and you got it at some point, and then you found out it wasn't very good or it didn't suit your needs
Right.
or your choir or what. So that just changed the game so quick, so much. But it's also, I think, um, there's just so many sort of sides to this. But if you say look back 10 years, so sort of pre Black Lives Matter and pre sort of this diversity emphasis, even then you could see that, say, music from the US was becoming more popular. I mean, there was Eric Whitacre, of course, but
Right.
he wasn't the only one. There were many others. Um, all the Morten Lauridsen's, Jake Runestads, and so on. So there was more of that. Um, and I think that was also popping up a little bit more in the studies. They're always, I think, any university will always be a little bit more conservative than society is, at least so far has been. So it didn't change quickly, but I think if I talked to the people studying now, I think their understanding of choral music would be much broader. It's not as broad as it should be. I mean, I think one huge area, both in number of compositions and just geographically, that I don't know if the word is neglect, but we don't sort of know enough about, is Asia,
Hmm.
because there's some fabulous choral music. I mean, sure, some of it is in the Asian languages, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, but they're not sort of basically any more difficult to approach if you have the same kind of help that you normally have with any
Right.
foreign language.
Right.
Have someone reading the text and
Right.
coming in comments.
Right.
But we just don't know the stuff well enough,
Right.
possibly because Asian choirs don't really tour North America all that much. So you just we're not exposed to it enough. But that's definitely an area that we don't get enough of.
Do the
African music, yeah.
do the Canadian or the American, North American publishers usually pick up music from that part of the world?
I don't follow them probably closely enough to just say anything really definite, but I think they have these series, where there's a choral conductor, Ella Smith
Right. Right. Right.
from Minnesota, who's got her own series, and
Right.
then Ella can sort of bring into that series music that Ella has come across wherever
Right.
it might be from. So
Right.
there are these means, but I would, on the whole, say that not
Enough.
to a great extent.
Right.
No, I think I don't know why. It's sort of some of it is like I think like Japanese music is often also culturally very intricately woven into their way of expression
Hmm.
and being,
Hmm.
gestures, that it can feel very difficult. Sort of need that cultural key, which
Right.
would normally probably be a conductor who could sort of help you with it. Um, but again, I don't see all that many guest conductors from that part of the world around here either. So
Right.
I think we're just short on people who could open the cultural doors a little bit
Right.
ajar, and
Right.
then I think the music would flow easier.
Right.
But yeah, so where I think it's still sort of very Euro and North America centric. I think we're all working on it, but it still is just, you live in the world you live in, and you can only change it gradually.
Hmm.
But there's South America, lots of fabulous choral music, which again, because of its rhythmic character, can
Right.
feel oh so difficult.
Right. Right.
Stuff that is really sort of the stuff that they do all the time
Right.
and does not seem to feel
Right.
incredibly difficult for them
Right.
can be excruciatingly difficult.
Right.
So there are these sort of cultural barriers which are just, that we're not used to it, and we need to be exposed more to it. And I think it'll happen because I think people are quite open that there's no sort of, oh, our music is
Hmm.
better.
Hmm.
It's just a question of that. When I try it, it's hopelessly bad.
Right. Right.
So I often feel that I need, like for my choir, I need someone to come and conduct a concert with knowledge of that music, that tradition, those
Right.
cultures, those
Right.
texts,
Right.
the ways of singing, everything. And then when they're there, it feels like, oh, this isn't that difficult. I get it.
Right.
But you need that coach, as it were, to really help open those doors.
So it's just as much important as interpreting the music on the paper itself to
Oh,
understand the culture background of the composer
I
and that
mean,
composition.
I mean, the stuff on the paper has very limited information
Right.
value. Like, even if we take something that we really think that notation is meant for, like romantic music,
Hmm.
it doesn't tell us how to play the notes. It
Hmm.
doesn't tell us whether we're meant to tie the notes together
Hmm.
or separate them.
Hmm.
Much of the most important thing you hear when you hear the music is actually missing from the notation. And then I think you'll know this, that when a composer tries to add all the information, it becomes so convoluted it's almost
Right.
impossible to read.
Right.
So this tradition of performing the
Mm-hmm.
music sort of has to exist
Mm-hmm.
as it, or it's the key to unlocking what it should sound like.
Right.
Or it should sound like is too strong, because I don't really believe in that. I believe you should be able to try all sorts of things, but
Right.
there are these certain keys that if you don't have them, it just it feels like it doesn't work, which is the
Right.
sort of the musician's test. This sort of weird sentence, it works. And when it doesn't work, then at least I'm completely lost. I don't know what to do, because it just, hold it, I'm doing everything I think correctly, and it just doesn't work. So we often need these sort of cultural interpreters, musico-cultural, and even just cultural interpreters. Yeah, to just give you an idea of what's missing, you
Mm-hmm.
know.
Mm-hmm.
And we had, I think, a really good example was we had Rolla Dilworth, who's a black composer from the US, has written a lot of these sort of modern um, spirituals,
Mm-hmm.
sort of in the style of spirituals, but they're contemporary. He also writes the texts. And so much of what he worked with when he was working with the choir was that, no, that's what it looks like on paper, but it should be like this. And those just things that if you don't have the culture, you just don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think that's one reason why, well, it's almost why we almost have to stick to what we know
Right.
predominantly.
Right.
Then we try to foray out.
Right.
And yeah, I don't know if
So
that answers your question at
no, it
all, but
it does. I
went
was
on a
just
rant.
I was just trying to understand the scene of music, so to speak, in when
Yeah,
at the time when you were in, it was at the Sibelius Academy that you did your master's and
yes.
your
Yeah,
PhD as well,
yeah.
right? So
Yeah, I'd sort of, if just answering that question finally after going around in circles, um, very classical, very classical.
right.
Even to the point, this is sort of starting to feel like prehistory now, but in the 80s, the prevailing ideology or ideal of classical music was really sort of pretty hardcore contemporary edgy stuff.
Hmm.
To the extent that I remember I was in a choir that commissioned a piece from a composer who'd written this quite atonal but very elegant piece for choir 10 years earlier. And then this was about 1985 approximately. He's asked to write a piece, and he writes this piece, which is sort of nowadays would feel, that's how choral music is. Sort of this sort of neo UT,
Hmm.
Neue Schönheit kind of
Hmm.
thing. There's a lot of tonality. There are these major and minor chords.
Hmm.
I remember we were all felt let down. What is this? This is trash. So actually, the sort of the time that I grew up was this sort of it's sort of a modernism that just it exists a little bit in orchestral music still, but even there you hear these softer tones and sort of more influences coming in from jazz chords and so on. But sort of that that sort of edgy ping pong
Right. Right.
music
Right. Right.
was the thing. So in a way, I feel fortunate to have sort of grown through that, and then come these shocks like the music of Arvo Pärt, for
Right.
example. That
Right.
first time I heard it, I was sort of, is someone allowed to compose like this?
Right.
Isn't this forbidden? Um, so there's been a big shift, which you lose sight of very easily. But then when I look back, sort of I go, oh, wow, it's changed so much. But yeah, so the scene where I grew up was very classical, and very contemporary.
Hmm.
Sort of that was the emphasis. Sort of new music, new demanding music was sort of that was class A.
Right.
And Class B was probably early music.
Right.
Class C was romantic music,
Right.
and Class D was everything else.
I
Um,
see.
so it's been a sort of a big, big sort of voyage to grow out of small boxes like that, just to seeing that, for example, that contemporary music means all the music that is written nowadays, and it's all interesting because it's written nowadays.
Right.
It sort of somehow reflects
Right.
this world.
Right. Um, Other thing that I noticed from all the things that you were saying is how much the government and the state was involved in developing the music culture as well as the arts, probably the whole of art scene
Mm-hmm.
in general. So working in different parts of the world as a choral conductor, and also I know you've sometimes dabbled with the administrative side of things. Uh, how does Canada stand? Like, what kind of changes are we looking for, if there are any?
Mm. I think Canada is interesting in many ways. Um, First of all, there is a lot of support for the arts. Sort of, it can always be more,
Right,
but I think, or let's say that the support is rather thinly spread, rather than given to certain big players.
right,
The big players do get, but if you look at, say, the professional orchestras, they do a lot of fundraising themselves, which is not the case for European orchestras. That their funding comes almost, I don't know what they make in ticket sales, but I would say like 75%, 80% would come from the state or the
right,
city or
right,
whoever it
right,
is, or the radio
right,
company or whatever it is. Um, so the big players do get support, but they also sort of live on fundraising,
right,
like big departments for fundraising.
right,
Um, and then the sort of the smaller players all get a sliver, which is great. I mean, like many of the community choirs, the ambitious community choirs, do get regular funding,
right,
which I think is brilliant. But at the same time, because the pot is not endless, that means that some of the professional forces um, are perhaps a little bit underfunded,
right,
in my view,
right,
because then it just they just cost so much more. It's just
right,
exponential, unfortunately. Um, but yes, so there is a lot of support. Um, but I think my sort of general view would be that it's quite thinly spread. So it has an efficacy which is maybe more sustaining
mhm,
rather than allowing development. So if you're going to develop, you need to be able to fundraise very well and so on. And that's always, I mean, not a bad thing in my view. I mean, it's not something I oppose in any way, but it is you need to put quite a lot of eggs in the fundraising basket to get more eggs,
yeah,
and
exactly,
not many organizations can afford that.
right,
So it sort of um, it seems a very democratic approach, but it's really not.
right,
It's sort of the big sort of benefit from
right,
it. So it's sort of, and then one thing I need to mention is that during COVID, the COVID shutdown and the couple of really difficult years that followed, Canada supported the arts in a fabulous way.
right.
And it
It's true.
really kept alive a lot of the organizations, and made possible for individuals also to lead a reasonable life, even in those circumstances where, especially freelancers, contractors, everything disappeared. So that was sort of something I'm never going to forget. Sort of I am grateful for that, and I always sing Canada's praises when I'm elsewhere. but for the way it sort of approached those times. It was very expensive, and maybe it led to
A lot of
led
debt,
to
national debt.
debts and yeah. So later on, but sort of it was exceptional, to be
Right,
honest. Yeah. So there's lots of good things, but I think it's really difficult to sort of say that you should maybe concentrate more on certain things,
right,
making certain professional, because you know there is a big difference in the professional scene, not because you know a professional is grander or better because it's professional, but this is people who are paid for their work, so
right,
it's part of the work market,
right,
and Canada trains an incredible amount of artists
right,
because universities don't really count, you know, how many jobs there are in the arts. They just school people because they want to be schooled
right,
in the arts.
right,
So there are so many artists around that don't have the chance to you know get a regular job, as it were, well-paid regular job, but have to do contracted jobs for many, and to sustain those people, you need money,
right,
and if it's spread very thin all over, that's a problem.
right.
Um, but sort of these are, it's always sort of a
That's
it's a balance that
that's a
you'd
very
love,
interesting point. The number of
you'd
people who
love
are
to sort
coming
of,
out of,
yeah,
sorry, I
isn't
cut
it?
you off. Yeah. The number of people
And
coming out of universities versus how many people
yeah,
can actually be employed in arts.
yeah,
It's an interesting point.
and it's sort of, I think it's fair enough because the educational system allows you to do a bachelor's in almost whatever and then do a master's in something else.
Right,
So in a way, you can just use that as a what should I say, as a you know, a little bit like a liberal arts
right,
degree, that
right,
you just accrue, you know, wisdom
right,
and and sort of an understanding of things, which is a little bit different than if you go to business school after that.
right,
You'll have your point of view will be a little bit different, or you go to law school or
right,
whatever.
right.
Um, it so it's not the worst thing in the world because there is this flexibility as
Hmm.
far as doing a master's then
Hmm.
goes, but not everyone is able to do a master's.
Hmm.
It's not cheap and so on. So there's a even as a parent, there's sort of two sides to the question of what should you study.
Right,
One side of me says, well, go study something that you know will give you a good living, many possibilities, like a lawyer or something.
right,
And the other side of me is go and study something you love because you know it'll be so different studying something like that you're really passionate about.
right.
So it really is a sort of double-edged sword.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
someone can be passionate about law. I, mean, I don't say that, but normally not as passionate as
yeah,
about
yeah,
the
yeah,
arts.
yeah, yeah,
It feels like it often feels like I have to do this. There's no option. Sort of that I need to do this, and to say to someone like that, don't, would be just pretty awful.
yeah. It's very true. In terms of education, do you think that it is kind of the same kind of education that happens in terms of training conductors and other kind of these kind of music leaders in Finland versus here?
No, that is a big difference, and you might sort of be aware of all the Finnish conductors around the world, which is sort of absolutely disproportionate compared to the population of the country. I
Right,
mean, it's the population of BC,
right,
Finland,
right,
and there's tens of us all around the world.
right,
So there has to be some, especially orchestral conductors. There has to be something that is different. And what is different is, well, first of all, the tradition of training conductors is a bit different, and there is a stronger, longer tradition. But the big difference is that here very often conducting studies at a master's level. So that means you've got sort of realistically, if you look at calendar years, you've got 18 months
hmm
of training,
hmm
and
right,
and that's even you have to take away the summer,
right,
so
yeah,
14 months.
yeah,
We all did 5 years,
right,
and that 5 years is sort of intense work with real ensembles. So
Right.
we have the choral conducting program has a choir of 16 that is there for, I think, 5 hours a week, just for the students, professional singers. And the orchestral conductors have an orchestra which is only exists for them about the same amount of hours every week.
Right.
So you get podium time with real musicians
Right.
constantly.
Right.
And that makes such a difference. And also, I think that the starting level of the conductors is way higher than I've seen in most places in the world. And funnily enough, the youngest generation of conductors that is now sort of making a splash, they started as kids. They sort of their early teens,
Right.
with this old professor who teaches them. So
That's
by
incredible.
the time they're the age that they would graduate, like 22, they've studied for 8 years.
Right.
They've studied conducting for 8 years,
Right.
which is sort of if you're a good, say, instrumentalist, or a singer, that's a really good place to start. The foundation is solid, but then you need time to learn this specific thing. Of course, just the gestural language, but also sort of, how to read a score, how to speak to people, how
Right.
to make them do things, what is the most efficient way of rehearsing. And it takes time. And the 18 months is a big ask. The
Right.
ones that go to doctoral school definitely have a more compatible sort of academic training to Europe.
Right.
But I think the European music universities are still pretty much like the old conservatories. Like, I wrote a thesis of, I think, 7 pages for the masters. That was it. Everything else was music.
Wow.
So it's still very focused. I think it's changed a little, but it's still it's built on the old European conservatory model, sort of like the Juilliards or Oberlins and so on, these schools. Whereas I think most of the places where people study conducting are within the universities,
Right.
and there's a whole lot of academia that goes with
Right.
it, and
Right.
academic
Right.
subjects and demands and so on. So the possibility to focus entirely is, well, it's not quite as entire, I think. So it's just that I think European conductors often have a bit of a head start because of the system. And also maybe that, like in Finland, there's only one place that sort of trains conductors
Right.
on the highest level. So that means that they're very they're the cream of the cream, and also that the sort of the dynamics become really vibrant because that the energy is all in one place. I mean, it's a small country, so, and I think if you just looked at BC, then UBC would definitely sort of have
Right.
the same kind
Right.
of role, but it's even sort of more than that.
Right. That's very interesting.
Yeah. So in a way, just being so limited
Right.
also
Right.
creates excellence in a way, or creates the possibilities for excellence, maybe in a way that is not all that typical.
So in terms of early music, how did you get into the whole early music situation?
When I was sort of starting out as a choral singer, in my sort of just coming into my 20s, it was the time when the sort of what we now call the hip movement, or the
Right.
historically informed
Right.
performance
Right.
movement,
Right.
really took off. I mean,
Right.
it had been sort of quietly boiling um, under the lid since the late 60s. but it was more, there was just this constant tug of war, that the people who were not in the movement just said, oh, there's just people who can't play
Right.
instruments properly, so they have to do this funny thing. And
Right.
but it was then just when we come to the 80s, it sort of started becoming not mainstream, sort of at least sort of knocking on the door of mainstream classical music, that is. And there were more and more recordings, groups like the Tallis Scholars or the Monteverdi Choir Orchestra,
There's a Iliad ensemble or something like that that
Iliad
started.
Ensemble. All these were sort of gaining traction amongst people who listen to classical CDs a lot.
Right.
And so I was already hooked on that, sort of, especially the Renaissance side. I mean,
Right.
I love the Baroque stuff, but that I didn't feel the difference was as big, because if you heard Renaissance music before this time, it was dreadful.
Right.
If you try it with big vibratos and big choirs, it just
Right.
makes no sense.
Right.
So suddenly you start hearing these crystal clear things, these lines that are just soaring and beautiful and perfect. So I was really hooked on that. And then we started singing that stuff in the choir that I mentioned that we founded, that we started singing madrigals and motets. And so I was really sort of, that was something, I was a bit sort of, I was early onto that wave
Right.
in Finland, I
Right.
think,
Right.
with some other people, admittedly, but still sort of fairly early. And then actually the Hilliard ensemble that you mentioned had a summer course in Finland, because there was this all TB tenor bass ensemble that just wanted to get teaching from them,
Right.
but it was too expensive. So what they did was they brought him over and they brought other ensembles to pay for it, so they could have these guys to themselves. But that meant that there was this possibility of working with these world-class people. I was just starting out singer. We just founded an ensemble for the course, and I can't remember how many, probably 3 or 4 summers we did that course with them. And that was one of my universities. I've got to say that was just getting, we were talking earlier about the transference of culture,
Mm-hmm.
the transference of that English culture of singing early music.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, I disagree with some of it nowadays, but it was so important to get a key to unlock those doors. And then once you're in, you could sort of look at it in another way. But that was so important. And for some reason, the guys who were like 20 years older than I am, I guess, but they sort of took me under their wing a little. I was very hot-headed and then argumentative, and I had opinions about everything and anything, really a nuisance, I think. But they sort of tolerated me and listened to me and sort of took me seriously. And that was a big lesson for me, sort of for my life as well, sort of that how important it is to take people seriously, and especially younger people, that
Right.
you don't just brush by
Right.
them. You really try to listen to them and give them the feeling that someone is interested in them.
Right.
So there was this sort of this mentorship before I've ever probably even heard the word mentor. And also just this musical transference of culture. And tell you what, those cats sang in tune. Their intonation was at times just otherworldly. And to be in the same room with people who do that and to sing with them just changes your ears.
Right.
It just, you suddenly sort of, it's like you see all the colors instead of these I see fairly bright colors, but then you see them all. You see them in their pureness. So there was a lot that just opened a lot of doors. And then one choir that I sang in, the conductor had also gone to these courses, and so he chucked in a lot of Renaissance stuff as well. So I was subjected to it much more than many other people. And then some crazy people decided to found a vocal ensemble to sing just Renaissance music.
Right.
They actually asked me, "Do you know any tenor who we could ask?" And I said, "What about me?" And they went, "What?" And yeah, and that's the start of a group called Lumen Valor, which I sang in for 25 years
Oh, wow.
after that. And we've, especially in the beginning, it was all early music, mainly
Right.
Renaissance, but then it sort of then we started throwing in contemporary stuff on the
Right.
side and Baroque a little bit as well. But that was so I've sort of been in that's been one part of what I do
Right.
sort of
Right.
pretty much my whole career. And nowadays when the stuff that I do in Finland is almost 100% early music. I have a group there called Idodici that gathers when it has money. There's a couple other guys who try to find things for it to do, but it sort of has I think the real sort of the people who are best at this stuff in
Hmm.
Finland.
Hmm.
Were sort of between 6 and 12, depending on the program. So it's still sort of that's something that I still have very strong ties to in Finland. And then I noticed actually here that I'd avoided a lot of the stuff that made me what I am. So I avoided sort of Finnish music. I avoided Nordic music. I avoided Baltic music. I avoided early music. And then someone said, "What am I doing?" Sort of, hey, I can do what
Right.
I like, and I know this is stuff that people enjoy.
Right.
So I'm definitely looking at expanding the amount of early music that the chamber choir does. And we've sort of worked with not only the whole choir but smaller groups,
Right. Right.
and that they've proven to be incredibly good
Right.
at this. Um, so there's lots of reasons to pursue more of it now. But I think I just needed to take a break and also sort of start from what the choir had been doing
Right.
and not sort of right off,
Right. Right.
but
Right.
sort of then gradually
Right.
grow in different directions. But yeah,
The
it's
last early music
definitely
concert was incredible. I was there.
the one in
Uh,
May.
yes.
I was really happy with that, and that was probably the biggest risk I've taken because it's really difficult music. This was music from the 15th
Hmm.
century, basically.
Hmm.
Sort of it 1450 to 1500 was the main notch where we worked, and a lot of it is incredibly demanding. And these people had not sung together as an early music group that
Right.
much,
Right.
and some of them not at all.
Right.
And I thought they did an incredible job with it. So I'm really sort of I was vindicated in trying it
Right.
out. It's also a repertoire that no one else sings
Right.
here locally. I mean,
Right.
EMV brings in Early Music Vancouver brings in some really nice groups too
Right.
that do some of this stuff, but I think there's lots of room for it. One point I always like to make about early music is that it's not really from a different era.
Right.
I know that sounds a bit weird, but because we perform it now, we are from this time.
Right.
The places where we perform it are from this time.
Right.
The audience is
Right.
from this time.
Right.
It when it happens, when it becomes physical reality, sound waves, it's no longer from
Right.
1450. It's
Right.
from now. It
Right.
comes out of the mouth right
Right.
now.
Right.
So in that sense, I've actually toyed with a concept idea, which would be early music from the 1660s and 70s and the 1960s and 70s, because I claim that the musical landscape of the 1960s and 70s, and maybe even the world, is further away from what we are than maybe 1550.
Right.
or 1650.
Right.
The music especially.
Right.
So that in a way, if we say it's early music, well, so is music from 1960.
Hmm.
It's not from this world.
Yeah.
It,
It is
it sort
not.
of it becomes real again in
Yeah.
this world when we're
Yeah.
from it. But sort of that's why I sort of sometimes I despair with the words early music,
Right.
because it's not. And it's certainly no earlier in many senses than say romantic music is.
Right. Right.
So what's the difference? Why should it be called early music?
Right.
Someone once says, a friend of mine who's sometimes pretty sharp with his words said that, in the music academies, we teach three things. We teach early music, we teach contemporary music, and we teach music, which is, that's how the words make no sense
Right.
unless you actually accept
Right.
that in the middle there's this thing
Right.
called music, which is
Right.
from Mozart to
Right.
Richard Strauss,
Right.
which is the thinking that no longer, is very valid.
Sorry, how do you mean that? I didn't quite understand the last point you were making.
Sort of there has been this idea in the sort of typical conservatory training that you are taught music, and music means the stuff from Mozart to
Right.
Richard Strauss.
Right. I see.
That's what we really train you to do.
Right.
Then, if you're a bit weird, you can sort of specialize in stuff which is sort of after
Right.
music,
Right.
i.e., contemporary music, to which we count stuff from the 1960s, which
I
is
see.
ridiculous.
Right.
Or then early music, which
Right.
is then before this real music starts. It's sort of
Right.
really interesting, but it's not really the.
Right.
And maybe it's accepting to some extent that those require different cultural keys.
Right.
But I suspect that Mozart and Verdi require different cultural keys as well.
It does.
So I think with sort of, it's not as unified as
Right.
you might think it
Right.
is.
Right. That's very true. That's very true. Can I ask you some questions about how you prepare for a concert, like in terms of programming? You mentioned about like how you would like to incorporate all those elements that you like in music as a whole. But in terms of preparing for one particular concert, like what do you do after the program has been set? How do you prepare the score or study the score?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, the looking for repertoire is it's a big part of what I do. I have, well, this next season is now starting to be pretty much set in stone, word for word. So that's 1 year
Mhm.
ahead. And I have some pretty clear ideas about 25, 26. And I'm now starting to sort of chuck in things for 26, 27, and
Right.
so on.
Right.
So, and to fill those blocks is a big thing. The system, just if I speak about this for just a minute, the way I work with that is that I try to find something which I can latch onto. So, which sort of creates if not a theme, it sort of creates a box that I'll label something, this kind of stuff. And then
Right.
I start trying to find stuff that I can
Right.
throw in the box.
Right.
First, there's too much,
Right.
but I would just sort of list them. And
Right.
then at some point, when I need to start solidifying what this will be, I start taking things out and organizing this
Right.
in a certain, and that probably happens like about a half year before the next season.
Right.
But as I say, I keep my eyes open all the time. People send me a lot of stuff, which is great. And then I just follow follow YouTube and Spotify and the choirs I like and stuff
Right.
like that. And what I hear somewhere, someone mentions, hey, have you heard this? Go and check it out.
Right.
So it's sort of a continuous process. Whereas then the other side is the one concert that you mentioned that is sort of a more set process, which I normally try to dedicate 2 weeks for the learning of that music, if possible longer. Like the first concert of the season is really nice because I have a lot of summer. So I've sort of been percolating that stuff for 2 months. And I'm now really getting into the sort of nitty gritty and really what I do. And basically what preparing for me is well, first of all, just to sort of going through the text, knowing what it means. Just having a look at it and have, is it beat in 3 or 5 or whatever, and just the technical side of it, sort of a fairly generic picture of it first. At that point, I often listen to recordings just to hear just things that other people have done, and then I forget them and let sort of the process lead me. But then the big phase and the phase that I always find a little bit terrifying beforehand is what I call sort of gaining an inner hearing of the piece. It doesn't mean you sometimes hear these, these conductor stories. I hear this perfect orchestra in my head playing this. I'm not quite sure that that's very reliable. I wouldn't understand why they then listen to recordings. But be that as may, what it means for me is sort of having an idea of how this moment should sound and where it's going the next moment. Sort of just, and the stronger this is, the stronger my sense of what this next moment sounds like is, the better I'm prepared. So this is, I sit at the piano, play chords. I stare at the score for hours, make markings. Normally, just I use 2 colors, red and blue, but then very often when there's layers in the music, I use even other colors just to and this is not sort of because I couldn't learn to read it without. It's just an aid that catches my eye and helps me remember it quicker. And also, I just feel physically that if you make a marking, some kind of mark is left in your brain. Whereas if I just look at it, it's sort of, it can disappear easier. For me, that people are really different in this.
It's
some
very
people
true.
are adamant that no markings at all.
It's very true.
But I think the majority of conductors do make a lot of markings in the score. And then this process is the longest. So you get stronger and stronger in your understanding of the piece. Then once I have that, I tend to check if there are metronome markings. Tend to check whether I'm anywhere near. Because sometimes you get used to a certain piece of or a section from the work, and it just feels so good at this tempo, and you go, hold it, it's completely sort of, that's far too fast or far too slow. So you just sort of learn to get closer to what the composer has marked. It doesn't have to be 100%, but don't want to be very far from it. And then towards the end of the process, I start conducting it. Just have the score in front of me, and I just conduct it. I often sort of talk. So I go, de grande cuillère de neige, and so on. So that I have some physical material, so that I can't just sort of glide over it. And then this was a big change when I came here, and started working sort of 100% with a professional choir is that the prep time I need to take just expanded. I need to be so much better prepared because they read the music so quickly that
Right.
if I don't know it, then I'm in trouble.
Right.
And also then the process goes nowhere because
Right.
I'm just happy that they're reading it right, but that's about it.
Right.
Whereas with an amateur choir, you have say 2 months
Right.
of time, even though it's one rehearsal a week. That time still is on your side, and you in a way you want to leave some learning for yourself as well for that 2 month process. You accept that you're going to go deeper, but now with 2 weeks and say 7 rehearsals, there's so little time that it will happen,
Mm-hmm.
but you need to be longer down the road
Mm-hmm.
for it to end well.
Right.
And there's also the preparing for the rehearsals, also knowing what is difficult.
Right.
So what you're going to have to work with, what you're
Right.
going to have to help the singers to find. Um, so it's just an endless amount of detail work.
Right.
And I always say that basically you should never conduct something for the first time because you never know it as well as you do the second time.
Right.
Because that process just makes it so much more ingrained. And you've also gone through the process of doing it with physical people. So you know the difficulties now concretely instead of theoretically. But that would limit my repertoire quite a lot. And I think everyone gets tired with what I do. So I sort of I jump into the same boat as the singers very often, that none of us have performed this before.
Right.
And in a way, it's a wonderful place to be as well. It's terrifying, but it's also incredibly rewarding, and it keeps you alive, and it keeps you humble.
Right.
Because if you always just did the pieces you know so well, it'd be so easy to say everyone, why don't you get this?
Right.
But when you're in that same position, that's, am I going to get this?
You'd be on the
And
edge.
you just become, yeah, you're just more human.
Right. Do you have any advice for up and coming conductors? Like, what would you say are the qualities they should cultivate? Like looking back at your younger self.
Conducting is such an impossible task. As you'll probably remember from your conducting studies, that there are so many sides to it. The gestural side, just theoretical side of things, but then just these things like group psychology, how to talk to people, how to motivate them.
Right.
Um, knowing languages, being able to speak efficiently and eloquently and whatnot. There's just so many sides that you'll never master them all.
Right.
So I think it's really important to identify what you're good at,
Right.
and then really trust it,
Right.
because that's what will be the reason for why people will flock to you is
Right.
that there is some strength. If you just look at your weaknesses, who's interested in that? You should be, but it's not what you ride on. So you try to identify what you're good at,
Right.
and you really sort of, that's what I do.
Right.
But then at the same time, you're aware of your weaknesses and you develop them. You're
Right.
not afraid of them.
Right.
What we very easily do is we avoid things that we feel are difficult for us.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, if we don't, we start learning them. So
Mm-hmm.
if you feel like, you know, I'm not really good with these complex rhythms,
Mm-hmm.
have a go. Sort of
Mm-hmm.
start working on them. You don't need to take the most difficult thing ever,
Mm-hmm.
but you keep at it. And one day you'll notice someone will come up and say to you, "You're pretty good with those rhythms."
Mm-hmm.
And it will be just a result of your perseverance.
Right.
So that's what I'd say, sort of look at what you're good at
Right.
and trust it, and then work on the stuff that you know you need to improve, and give yourself time. It
Right.
won't happen overnight.
Right.
And then I think just, be interested in everything, be curious, because every single thing you find in the world will probably be applicable.
Right.
You read a book, you'll find something that is applicable.
Right.
I've used Tolstoy's War and Peace. So, and that doesn't sort of first seem very applicable to choral conducting. But you'll find something everywhere if you're curious.
Right.
And that also makes you a little bit different
Right.
sort of to other people. And that's interesting for everyone.
Right.
And then I think it's just love the music. Just keep at it. Whatever, and I really want to emphasize that whatever music it is, just, delve into it.
Right.
You can always get better at it, even if you're good. And it's sort of it's like a language that that if I studied French by myself and did online courses and so on, it would never be the same as if I lived in a country or a place where French is spoken all the time. I spoke French all the time, and I would go from, even if I'd studied a lot, I'd go from being proficient to fluent to being natural.
Right.
And I think music is that kind of language where, I don't know if we ever get to natural, but fluency is something you can get closer to, I think,
Right. Right.
with time. And it takes time and then sort of experiences.
Awesome.
Something like that.
It's awesome. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate you coming and talking about all these things. Although I'm now realizing that we didn't talk much about cricket, but if you would like to watch,
Oh,
but if you would like to watch Kari play cricket, you have to go to the cricket club in Kitsilano and do that.
Maraloma, yes.
Right. Or catch up with Kari on the chamber choir concerts that is going to start by fall.
I'd love that. I'd love that. And then the first concert is September 27.
Right.
Fabulous program.
I will be in India at that time.
I can only recommend it. But for me, this is one of the most intriguing and interesting programs of the year.
Yeah. That's awesome. I will make sure to put a link for that as well.
Thank you.
When I upload the video. Thank you for your time. This is great.
It was my pleasure. Thanks, Sri.